This is an outline of the main points I'll be dealing with. It's a little bigger than this. It has 7 points altogether. So let me just jump in. Hopefully there's going to be time for a short question period at the end. So I'd like to ask you to please hold all questions until that time. Well, good afternoon, everyone. In the space of less than an hour, I'm going to attempt to give you an introduction to a subject that is almost as vast as it is vital, namely money. What I will tell you is what money is, and then what its existence makes possible. I'll explain how money came into existence and why gold in particular came to be money. I'll give you a statement of the quantity theory of money and indicate its great explanatory value in understanding the subject of inflation and the growth of monetary aggregates such as so-called gross domestic product, GDP. I'll explain why under economic freedom gold would almost certainly become money once again, and how such a monetary system would serve as a powerful check on the expansion of government and would operate to prevent inflation. And in its pure form, known as a 100% reserve gold standard, would operate totally to prevent deflation and depression as well as inflation. I'll indicate how the abuse of money through government interference is what is responsible for the problems of inflation and deflation and the closely related boom-bust business cycle. This interference includes the government's sanction and sponsorship of dishonest behavior by private banks in the form of credit expansion, that is, the granting of loans out of newly created money. I'll indicate the further consequences of the government's abuse of money through inflation, namely not only its own unchecked growth and the business cycle, but also capital decumulation and the consequent undermining of the productivity of labor, the arbitrary redistribution of wealth and income, and worst of all, the potential total destruction of money and all that depends on it. As to the remedy, that will be the subject of my class, The Path to Sound Money, this coming Saturday. On Friday, in the Economics of Inflation, I'll deal with the nature and consequences of inflation in greater detail, especially showing why inflation is the government's increase in the quantity of money and not at all rising prices in and of themselves, and how this proposition is actually supported by the opposing theories. Well, let me start now with what is money. Money has been defined as a generally accepted medium of exchange. In simple language, it's a good that everyone in a society is willing, indeed eager, to accept in exchange for his own goods or services. And once they obtain money, people subsequently use it in order to re-exchange it for the goods and services of others, who are just as eager to accept it from them. To all appearances, it seems that everyone is willing to accept money simply in the conviction that everyone else is willing to accept it from him. Now, for the importance of money. However it is that money comes into existence, the fact that it does exist is enormously beneficial. Without it, the division of labor society on which modern material civilization rests could not exist. A division of labor society is characterized by the fact that each individual lives by producing or helping to produce just one, or at most a relatively small number of things, all of which, or practically all of which, are consumed by others. At the same time, almost everything that any individual consumes in such a society is produced by the labor of others. Just think of any job you may have had and how specific was the nature of that job and who ultimately physically benefited from its being done. If, for example, you worked in a button factory, the physical beneficiaries of your work were the people who got those buttons on their shirts or whatever. Then think of all the kinds of work that are done by other people in producing all the things that you consume, from air conditioners and automobiles to products containing zirconium. Among the benefits of a division of labor society is the fact that the volume of knowledge employed in production is radically increased. Instead of everyone living as a self-sufficient farmer and having the same meager knowledge pertaining to production as everyone else, the volume of knowledge employed in production comes to reflect the combined bodies of knowledge of all the different specializations and subspecializations. And every individual benefits from this radically enlarged body of knowledge in his capacity as a consumer. Okay, we're lucky it came back. Now, I think I see what the problem is. Probably my screensaver kicks in, and I'll have to keep tapping this. All right. Well, among the benefits is this radically enlarged body of knowledge that enters into the production of goods and services, and each one of us, in his or her capacity as a consumer, is in a position to get the benefit of this enormous body of knowledge. When you buy an automobile, you're getting the benefit of the specialized knowledge of the automobile producers, the steel producers, the petroleum producers. When you're buying anything, you're getting the benefit of the knowledge of everyone directly or indirectly connected with its production. Now, a division of labor society which provides this immense benefit and many others that I can't go into at the moment, a division of labor society would not be possible in the absence of the existence of money. In the absence of money, goods and services would have to be exchanged in barter for other goods and services. The producer of each good or service would have to find some way of exchanging the specific good or service that he produced for all the goods and services he desired from everyone else. For example, the producers of sulfuric acid, ball bearings, steel girders, computer chips, haircuts, and whatever would have to find some way of using their goods or services in exchange for food, clothing, and shelter. But how many grocers or farmers, clothing stores or clothing factories, landlords or mortgage lenders have any need of such goods, let alone on any regular or reliable basis and from any specific such supplier? Also, how could the producers of such valuable indivisible goods as automobiles or houses use their products in exchange for goods of such small value as a loaf of bread? They could not break off a piece of a car or house and exchange it for the loaf of bread. In the absence of money, the only reliable means of obtaining life's necessities would be either to attempt to produce them oneself as a farmer, or to produce goods or services of the kind farmers frequently needed. Okay, I'm going to have to stop for a moment and try to take care of this. You can see I'm following interesting commodities here. Okay, goodbye Comcast. Okay. Now that's off. They're filming a new Marx Brothers movie while we're here. We're on? Okay. All right. In the absence of the existence of money, the only reliable means of obtaining life's necessities would either be to attempt to produce them oneself as a farmer, or to produce goods and services of the kind farmers frequently needed. For example, be a blacksmith or a country doctor. But that would mean the destruction of the highly productive specialization of the modern division of labor economy, and the loss of all manner of goods and services vital to a modern standard of living. The result would be dreadful impoverishment and outright mass depopulation. The existence of money prevents these problems. Because of money, it's not necessary for a producer to produce what any of his particular suppliers may want. It's only necessary for him to produce something that anyone, anywhere in the world wants, who is willing and able to pay money for it. Because once in possession of money, that producer is able to turn around and buy from anyone he wishes. Because as we've seen, money is something that everyone wants. So all you have to do is produce for anyone, anywhere who has money. Once you have the money, you can then be supplied by anyone. It's not necessary for your supplier to obtain the goods that you personally produce. Well, in this way, the existence of money radically widens the extent to which the division of labor can be carried. You can specialize in any branch, any line for which there are people able and willing to pay money. You do not have to produce what your particular suppliers want to have. That's the radical widening of the division of labor. At the same time, money provides the intellectual basis for the conduct of a division of labor society. Because of money and the existence of money prices for all goods and services, producers are able to compare money revenues with money costs and know whether or not they are producing successfully. In a monetary economy, a producer knows the money cost of his means of production and the money value of the product he produces and sells. Assuming that the buying power of money has not significantly fallen between the time he purchased his means of production and the time he sells his product, a money profit signifies an increase in his ability to obtain goods and services in exchange from others, and thereby marks his operation as successful. Closely related to this, the existence of money prices makes it possible to compare the costs of using different methods of production and to choose the most economical. It makes it possible to compare the profitability of producing different products and the profitability of investing in different branches of industry, and to compare the remunerativeness of working in one occupation rather than in another. Both by radically enlarging the extent to which the division of labor can be carried and by providing the essential guiding intellectual framework for its conduct, money makes possible modern material civilization. So far from being the root of all evil, it would be far more accurate to describe money as an essential foundation of all that is good in the material world. I turn now to the question of how money originates. Money originates in the conditions of barter. It originates by virtue of people seeking to exchange goods of what Menger calls lesser marketability for goods of what he calls greater marketability. What this means is that at any given time and place, some goods are more frequently desired by more people than are other goods. For example, even now, cigarettes are very widely desired. Certainly they are desired by far more people and with far greater frequency than is one's old typewriter, say. In the absence of the existence of money, it would make sense for the owner of such a typewriter who wished to exchange it for food or medicine, say, to exchange it for cigarettes, even though he personally did not smoke and perhaps personally abhorred smoking. All right. Mark, you're familiar with Dells, aren't you?
Sure.
Could I ask you to set the properties of my screensaver to like off for 5 hours? Okay. All right. Okay. Well, what I'll do, I'll let the screensaver go blank, and then when it's necessary for me to bring it up, I'll bring it up, and I'll bring up the outline. All right, so here we are. We have someone who owns an old typewriter. He personally doesn't smoke, hates smoking, but if he wants to obtain, say, medicine for his typewriter, it's very unlikely that he'd find anyone who has the medications he needs and who also wants his typewriter. So he'll be far ahead if he can exchange his typewriter for cigarettes, because there are a lot more people who'd like cigarettes than who want his typewriter. And the odds are that now there may be someone who has the medications who is a smoker, and that improves his chances. Or he can find someone who has what the owner of the medications likes. There's a greater chance of finding him. All right, well, the principle here is that starting with some good, possessing greater marketability on the basis of its use as an ordinary commodity, a new and additional demand emerges for it based on that fact. This new and additional demand serves to make that good even more widely and easily marketable than it was initially. In our cigarette example, the number of people ready and willing to accept cigarettes in exchange for their goods and services now includes not only the original core group wanting cigarettes to smoke, but a further group consisting both of smokers and non-smokers who want cigarettes for the purpose of re-exchanging them with those who wish to smoke them. Now, the market does not distinguish between the motives of those willing to accept a good in exchange, and to any observer it will now appear simply that cigarettes are more widely acceptable in exchange than they were before. This, of course, increases their usefulness as a medium of exchange and can thus serve to further increase the demand for them as a medium of exchange. The ultimate limit of this process is that everyone ends up willing to accept cigarettes in exchange for his goods and services, and after a while it appears simply that everyone accepts cigarettes because everyone expects everyone else to accept them. But the truth is that the initial foundation is the good's greater marketability as an ordinary commodity. That's what got the process going. The growing demand for a good for use as a medium of exchange, the demand which will render that good money once its use as a medium of exchange becomes general, serves to raise its value. In the case of cigarettes, it's entirely possible that if their supply were sufficiently limited, the rise in their value would be so great as to deter even the most ardent smokers from smoking very much, for then they would be smoking valuable money. If that were the case, the appearance of paradox would take on a further aspect. Not only would it appear that everyone accepted the monetary commodity simply because everyone else did, but also that the monetary commodity had no significant physical uses. Well, these considerations apply to gold, the actual money of the world for many centuries. Gold is by no means a commodity with merely trivial physical employments. When properly alloyed, it can be made to do most of the things that other metals, such as lead, copper, or even iron, can do. And it has unique properties as well, some of them of great use in the most modern technological applications. However, gold is very rare in nature, much rarer than most other metals. The combination of its utility and rarity establishes a value high enough to prevent the use of gold for purposes that can be served by other more abundant metals and limit its use to purposes that require more or less unique properties. The very existence of a high value of gold based on its use as a physical commodity serves to create additional uses for it. One such use is the giving of objects made of gold as gifts expressing high esteem for the recipient. The same point, of course, applies to other goods combining high value and great beauty, such as diamonds. This additional demand serves further to increase the value of gold and to make it still more suitable for expressing one's esteem for the recipient of a gift. The second, and potentially much more important new and additional use for gold is that its high value can create is the use of gold as a store of purchasing power. That is, as something which one saves in order to have the means of buying in the future. I believe that this use, usually described as gold's use as a store of value, directly underlies its development into a medium of exchange. Menger and many other Austrians, of course, believe that the use of gold as a medium of exchange precedes its use as a vehicle for saving. I'm maintaining the opposite, that its use as a vehicle for saving precedes its use as a medium of exchange. Certainly the potential for gold developing into a medium of exchange in this way was well underway in the 1970s, and could occur again in the future anytime inflation comes to be widely perceived as a great and growing threat in the United States. Inflation destroys the value not only of fixed income investments, such as bonds and life insurance policies, but also the real value of stocks and family businesses. It undermines all business investment by virtue of the fact that it both artificially boosts business profits. You're taking in a flood of new and additional money coming from the printing presses, so that boosts your profits. And at the same time, it boosts the replacement prices of assets, which are used up in earning these profits. And the result of that is the far greater part of the additional profits is actually required for the replacement of assets. However, the additional profits are treated by the government as ordinary income and are thus largely taxed away, which makes the funds available for the replacement of assets insufficient. This consequence of inflation goes a long way in explaining such phenomena as the Rust Belt, the description of a huge swath of the United States, which was once a great industrial powerhouse, masses of rusted factories, machineries rusting away, and they're not able to have been replaced or maintained. And I think a major reason for that is that we had well over 10 or 15 years of accelerating inflation, fictional profits, most of which were needed to replace assets at higher prices, but which were inadequate because the government was taxing them away, treating them as ordinary income. Well, I know I've gotten way ahead of myself here, and I'm now indicating something I had originally planned to leave for much later, namely how inflation causes capital decumulation, but I've had to deal with it here instead. In circumstances in which inflation renders all the normal forms of investment open to most people unprofitable in real terms, people turn to inflation hedges, to things they can buy and hold whose price can be expected to rise more or less in line with the general run of prices, and thus leave them with at least substantially undiminished buying power rather than actual losses of buying power. Well, gold is the ideal inflation hedge for most people. As a metal, it will not die or rot, as will animal or vegetable products. And as a precious metal representing great value in small bulk, its storage costs are low. For example, 1 ounce of gold represents the same buying power as several tons of iron, a fact which results in a radically lower cost of storing buying power in the form of gold rather than iron or other base metals. The fact that as a metal, every ounce of gold of the same fineness is a perfect substitute for every other such ounce and is also divisible and recombinable gives gold important advantages over precious stones as an inflation hedge. In any case, in the 1970s, the growing demand for gold as an inflation hedge was in process of making gold a good desired by a group of people comparable in number to cigarette smokers. The existence of a group of people that numerous who would be willing to accept gold in exchange for their goods or services in order to add it to their holdings in provision for the future would have had the potential for making others willing to accept gold in the conviction that they could re-exchange it with those eager to save gold. As in the case of our cigarette discussion, the potential would have existed for everyone becoming willing to accept gold in exchange, and thus for a spontaneous remonetization of gold. I believe that gold originally became money on essentially this kind of foundation, namely its advantages as a store of value. It displaced a previous iron money in the old Roman Republic. I want to say that Mises was very eager to see the process of growing gold ownership continue and firmly opposed all impediments to it. His reason, which I fully share, is that the worst conceivable threat posed by inflation is the destruction of money, however remote this possibility may seem at the present moment. For reasons indicated in our discussion of barter, that would destroy the division of labor and thus modern industrial civilization. But widespread gold ownership would provide the foundation for the rapid replacement of paper money with a new gold money and thus prevent inflation from resulting in the destruction of money as such. It may be that the recent sharp increase in the price of gold and growing public interest in owning it marks the beginning, a faint beginning admittedly, of a move toward the remonetization of gold. Well, I turn now to what I consider to be one of the most important propositions in all of economics, namely the quantity theory of money. The quantity theory of money can be understood as the proposition that the quantity of money that exists is the major determinant of the amount of money that is spent. The quantity of money that exists is the major determinant of the amount of money that is spent. To illustrate this proposition, recall some old Western movie you may have seen, perhaps at 4 a.m. one night, featuring a bedraggled old prospector. Imagine that he finally strikes gold, digs enough gold nuggets out of the ground to fill a small pouch, and heads off into town. His new and additional gold will be physically manufactured into new and additional gold coins, which he'll spend in buying supplies and such things as rounds of drinks at the local saloon. The recipients of that spending will in turn re-spend that new and additional money. The recipients of their spending will do the same, and so on ad infinitum. The result is that new and additional money serves to permanently elevate the level of spending. So long as the new and additional money remains in existence, the volume of spending in the economic system will be correspondingly larger. The quantity theory of money, of course, applies to every money, irredeemable paper money as well as to gold money. Today, the new and additional money comes into existence virtually out of thin air, manufactured not only by printing presses, but nowadays also by computers that create new and additional checking balances. It might enter the economic system via the government sending out Social Security checks. Again, the recipients will spend that new and additional money, and those who receive it from them will re-spend it, and so on ad infinitum. I have to interject here that a system of irredeemable paper money can come into existence only on the foundation of a pre-existing commodity money, such as gold. It begins as paper that is not irredeemable, but rather fully redeemable on demand for gold. Without this foundation, it would have no greater chance of being accepted than would the paper money from the game Monopoly, because it would lack a pre-existing recognized exchange value. However, once enough time goes by for a generation or more of people to grow up with a constantly repeated experience of redeemable paper money being eagerly accepted in exchange for goods and services, and observing little or no actual day-to-day use of gold coin, the demand for money is transferred to the paper money. In such conditions, the demand for paper money may not be greatly reduced, even though it then loses its convertibility to gold. In the United States, the day-to-day use of gold coin had virtually disappeared by the time of our entry into World War I. What was responsible was the National Bank Act of 1863, which for the first time created a uniform national paper currency convertible into gold. I must point out that the increase in the quantity of money and the increase in the volume of spending that it fuels is the only factor that explains the growth or continuing growth in monetary aggregates, such as aggregate consumer sales revenues, which can be taken as a rough approximation of GDP, and the aggregate value of business assets and of outstanding securities in the economic system. In the absence of the increase in the quantity of money and volume of spending, all such monetary aggregates would tend to stabilize. Increases in the physical volume of goods produced and the physical assets accumulated could certainly continue at an undiminished or even more rapid rate than would otherwise be the case, but the result would be correspondingly falling prices and falling unit costs, not growing monetary aggregates. Well, now I turn to gold as the proper kind of money. An essential difference between gold money and irredeemable paper money is precisely the rate at which their quantities can be increased. Gold is rare in nature and must be laboriously dug out of the ground, almost always at considerable cost. Paper money can be produced at hardly any cost and in virtually limitless quantity. If the production of paper money were subject to the freedom of competition, with everyone legally free to manufacture it, it would quickly become valueless. Having no greater cost of production than goods like paper clips, pins, or rubber bands, and capable of being expanded in supply just as easily, it would soon have no greater exchange value than they do. Just as it now takes millions of pins to equal the value of an automobile or a house, so it would soon take millions of paper dollars, indeed billions and trillions of paper dollars, because the manufacture of $10, $100, and $1,000 bills is no more costly than the manufacture of $1 bills and can just as easily be expanded. Indeed, under freedom of competition between irredeemable paper and gold, the rapid depreciation of the paper would cause it to become altogether valueless. The demand for paper money would fall to zero as people sought the growing alternative of a gold medium of exchange, which would develop not only as the result of gold's growing use as an inflation hedge store of value, but also because people with sums of money to be paid to them in the future would more and more choose to have those sums payable in gold, whose purchasing power could be relied upon. This development would make gold all the more acceptable in exchange because people with debts or other contracts payable in gold, such as a lease, would be eager sellers for gold to obtain the means of meeting their gold obligations. In such circumstances, the only way that paper money could stay in existence would be by being made securely redeemable on demand in gold. For it would be gold with its stable, indeed increasing buying power that people wanted, not irredeemable paper with its rapidly falling buying power. What stops the triumph of gold, the obvious money of a free market, is the fact that we do not have a free market in money. On the one hand, the government makes the issuance of irredeemable paper currency its monopoly privilege. Its manufacture by anyone else is called counterfeiting and is punishable by law. This serves to restrain the rate of increase in the quantity of such money. The increase still continues, of course, and is far more substantial than is the increase in the supply of gold, but it does not reach astronomical levels, at least not for a more or less indefinite time. On the other hand, and this is actually the far more important factor, the competition of gold is substantially hobbled by measures ranging from the total prohibition of the private ownership of gold to refusals to enforce the terms of private contracts made in gold and subjecting gains from such contracts to rates of taxation high enough to take away the incentive to enter into them. Another major impediment of the government's prohibition is the government's prohibition against merchants accepting gold coins at their bullion value rather than their face value. And here we now finally need this. Okay, what I have here is a $20 gold piece. If you look carefully at the bottom of the coin, you can probably read $20. This was the principal gold coin of the United States before 1933. Up on top, United States of America, the seal of the United States, below $20. This is an enlarged picture. Here, I'll show you. That's like a gold pizza pie almost. Here's the actual size in the middle. And this, of course, is a current $20 bill. And notice both of them are marked $20. This is $20. That's $20. At one time, they were equivalent. You could give in a $20 bill, get a $20 gold coin. They were fully equivalent in their buying power. Now, the $20 gold coin contains just about 1 ounce of gold bullion, a shade less than an ounce of gold bullion. And gold bullion is currently selling in excess of $600 per ounce. To make the arithmetic a little simpler, we'll assume $600 even. Now, just imagine the implications if merchants were free to discriminate between two units each marked $20. A $20 gold coin and a $20 paper note. And that they could accept a $20 gold coin not as $20, but at its current bullion value of $600. So imagine that you ran up a bill somewhere. Let's say you took you and your spouse took out two other couples to a very first-class restaurant. It would be possible to run up a check for $600. Now, the way people would normally pay this would be they put it on a credit card, or possibly they might pay in currency. But suppose the restaurant were legally free to accept a gold coin at its bullion value, not at its face value. Well, what would that mean? It would mean you could give the restaurant one coin marked $20, and that would pay your bill. Well, your check is $600 in the paper, but in the gold, it's only $20. Now, that's something that calls for some pondering. Because think of the further implications. Suppose there is an automobile that's currently selling for $30,000. Imagine the automobile dealer was legally allowed to accept gold coin in payment at its bullion value rather than the face value. So here you go into the dealership with a little satchel of gold coins. You have one of them. You say, okay, that's $600. You count out 10, that's 6,000. You count out 5 more sets of 10, that's 50 gold coins. 50 times 600 is 30,000. But if you're looking at the face value of each one, it's $20, and you've paid 50 times $20. The price of that $30,000 car in gold is 1,000 gold dollars. So this is, I think, quite astonishing. A $30,000 car in the gold dollars is $1,000. A $300,000 house in gold is $10,000. We can apply it to the $20 bill. A $20 bill, this thing down at the bottom, evaluated from the standpoint of the gold coin, if we say, what I mean by $20 is this coin. That's my definition of $20. That's the definition implied by the Constitution of the United States. That's $20. Using that as the standard of price, this thing is 67 cents. A paper dollar, this in terms of gold is 3 1/3 cents. And so here we are, we have humongous prices, second and third rate actors getting $20 million a movie, everything sloshing in the billions. Well, start pricing these things in terms of gold, and at the present price of gold, everything would be 1/30th of where it is today. And as gold becomes more valuable, prices expressed in gold will actually go down. I had a little blog posted on Mises.org and my own blog site called Gasoline 10 cents a gallon and falling. Well, that's when gold briefly touched 700. At 700, 350 was equal to 10 cents, and gold looked like it was rising even further. So now perhaps gasoline in gold is 11 or 12 or 13 cents a gallon. Now, just think of the lesson that this would teach. If people went shopping and they saw, well, there's 2 sets of prices. We have these humongous prices in the paper, but prices in gold are a small fraction. And the same would be true if in the old silver coinage as well. Silver is now over $11 an ounce. $10 worth of silver are worth perhaps $90 in the paper. Not as big a multiple as gold, but still very substantial. So people would start to notice, where is the rise in prices? What's responsible? And it would dawn on them, there's something wrong with the paper money. The rise in prices is originating on the side of the paper money. And how would that affect the money they wanted to be paid? Well, they'd want gold. They'd want their pensions payable in gold. They'd want any leases they wrote as a property owner. They'd want that payable in gold. They'd want bonds with gold clauses. And you can see then that the people who gave such assurances of payment in gold, they would be very eager sellers for gold. Well, The rapid increase in the quantity of paper money, the extent to which it increases more rapidly than the supply of gold, that's the fundamental feature of inflation. It's the explanation of generally rising prices, of debtors gaining at the expense of creditors, of exchange rate depreciation, and every other feature of inflation. A gold money, in contrast, even though it too serves to increase spending, would probably not raise prices because the modest increase in its quantity would most likely be within the limit of the increase in the production and supply of ordinary goods and services, with the result that most prices would probably fall, as they did over the course of the 19th century. In 1900, prices on average were about half of what they had been in 1800, even though there was quite an expansion in the supply of gold in the world over the 100-year period. Now, I think the very best definition of inflation is precisely an increase in the quantity of money in excess of the increase in the supply of gold. And this definition, incidentally, can be found in Rothbard's Man, Economy, and State, and as far as I know, it's original with him, and I think it's one of his most important contributions, perhaps the most important. Now, an enormous difference between gold money and irredeemable paper money, which Mises identified, is the radical difference between them with respect to the relationship they engender between the citizens and the government. Gold money makes the government financially dependent on the citizens. Irredeemable paper money makes the government financially independent of the citizens and makes the citizens financially dependent on the government. Under gold money, whatever funds the government may possess at any given time leave its possession and enter the pockets of the citizens, who produce everything the government buys. To continue its operations, the government must regularly turn to the citizens for fresh money. It cannot obtain the gold it needs from any other source except the citizens. It is financially dependent on them. And the result is that every act of government spending is easily perceived as imposing a corresponding burden on the citizens. Every proposal for increased government spending in such circumstances represents an equivalent threat of increased taxes, with the further result that such proposals encounter strong resistance and are likely to fail. A policy of budget deficits under a gold standard is not an option. Every year of deficits increases the government's interest burden while doing nothing to increase its revenues. Indeed, a mounting public debt under a gold standard brings with it the specter of default and results in the withdrawal of capital and gold from the country and a reduction in the volume of spending and revenues in that country, including, of course, the government's tax revenues. The consequence is that all but the most recklessly irresponsible governments are compelled to operate with balanced budgets, which places them under the necessity of providing for all government expenditures out of current tax revenues. But under irredeemable paper money, conditions are entirely different. The ability to create such money gives the government a source of funds that does not depend on the citizens. The government now has its own independent source of funds, the printing press, or indeed simple ledger entries on the books of its central bank that enlarge its checking balances. In these circumstances, proposals for increased government spending do not appear as constituting any threat of increased taxes. The government is perceived as standing outside the economic system, free of the financial constraints that apply to all the individual citizens. It can finance additional spending without raising taxes, for it now has its own independent source of money. Thus, for example, the president can appear to give the people a, quote, prescription drug benefit as though it were a gift paid for out of his pocket and something for which we should all be grateful. Well, this transforms the character of political debate and results in an unchecked increase in government spending and government activity. The cost of new government programs no longer appears as a reason for rejecting them, because the connection between their cost and higher taxes has been broken. Political debate nowadays proceeds with the supporters of the programs enumerating their benefits to this or that group, and the opponents appearing to have no basis for their opposition other than some form of inherent naysaying or misanthropy. In just this way, the so-called liberals, i.e. interventionists and socialists, appear as the enlightened friends of mankind, while their conservative opponents are made to appear as the heartless enemies of human well-being. Indeed, things go even further. The nature of the radically changed monetary conditions drives the citizens to the conclusion that instead of them having to support the government can support them. For in fact, it is the government from whom they now obtain their money. The government's ability to create money appears as a magical bottomless purse from which the government is able to shower benefits upon the people, not only providing free benefits to the beneficiaries of its programs, but also enriching everyone else, everyone who receives the additional revenue and income generated by the continuing expenditure of the new and additional money. It is the mentality of the free lunch carried to the point of believing in a free breakfast and dinner for those who provide the free lunch. Its essence is expressed in Keynesianism and its doctrine of the government spending multiplier. An important manifestation of this mentality is the belief that Washington, a city devoid of practically all actual production, a city populated by hardly anyone but bureaucrats living on goods produced elsewhere while doing almost everything in their power to hamper economic activity everywhere, can somehow bail out other economically far more important cities such as Detroit, Cleveland, St. Louis, or New York. Indeed, bail out entire states and regions and the entire rest of the country. What permits this delusion is the fact that Washington is where the irredeemable paper money originates. However, another major proposition of monetary theory that can be found in Mises, and which is highly relevant here, is that unlike ordinary goods such as coal and cloth, whose physical ability to serve human needs depends on their physical quantity, a larger quantity of money does not provide any greater physical utility than does a smaller quantity. A $1 bill of a few decades ago bought as much or more than does a $10 bill today. What a unit of money can buy depends on prices. The effect of the government's increase in the quantity of money is merely to make prices higher than they otherwise would have been. The citizens of the United States could produce in exchange as much as they now produce in exchange, indeed substantially more than they now do, entirely without the increase in the quantity of money caused by their government. The effect of that increase, indeed, has not only been to make prices higher, but also to work against the increase in the production and supply of ordinary goods by undermining capital accumulation and thus the rise in the productivity of labor, as, for example, in the way I described earlier in connection with the taxation of profits that inflation creates and which are needed for the replacement of assets at the higher prices it causes. In other words, it turns out that the free benefits turn out to have costs, these and others. The public does not understand the consequences of the government's inflation and instead blames those consequences on the greed of profit-seeking businessmen. The public looks at the sharply increased paper profits accompanying rising prices and takes that rise in profits as proof of the businessmen's responsibility for the rise in prices. The usual definition of inflation as rising prices also leads to that conclusion. For if inflation is rising prices, then it comes into existence only in the instant in which businessmen raise their prices, by ordering the posting of higher prices on store shelves or in sales catalogs. The ignorant public then turns to the government, which it already views as Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy, for protection from what it considers the malicious evil of the businessmen, and it demands price and wage controls. Still another major proposition of monetary theory that can be found in Mises, and which as far as I know he was the first to discover and stress, is the fact that inflation does not serve to raise all prices at the same time and the same extent. This is very relevant to the subject of the costs imposed by inflation to finance the seemingly free benefits. Whoever introduces the new and additional money into the economic system enjoys a gain, in fact the greatest gain that can be obtained from the process. He usually, though not always the government, spends money he has not had to earn and buys the goods and services he buys at prices of which have not yet risen, or only to the extent his own buying has made them rise. To whatever extent the prices of the goods and services he buys do begin to rise, all other buyers of those goods and services suffer a corresponding loss in terms of their buying power. As the new and additional money travels from hand to hand, more and more prices rise. Those who receive the money relatively early have a gain. Those who receive it later on have a loss. They've been paying higher prices before their incomes rise, and this is one of the major ways that inflation operates as a mechanism, an arbitrary mechanism of redistribution of wealth and income. And it's one that's capable of achieving the equivalent of a major revolution. For example, the German hyperinflation of 1923 brought about an arbitrary redistribution of wealth and income fully comparable to that of the French and Russian revolutions. Well, let me turn now to the last major point. I want to conclude by explaining how inflation is the underlying cause of the business cycle and deflation. What's involved here is not a direct expansion of money by the government, but a government-sanctioned and government-sponsored process of inflation that Mises calls credit expansion, namely the creation and lending out, or the lending out of newly created money. Credit expansion is the lending out of newly created money. And it centers on what Mises calls fiduciary media. Fiduciary media are transferable claims to standard money, payable on demand by the issuer and accepted in commerce as the equivalent of standard money, but for which no standard money actually exists. Today, standard money is this stuff, the paper currency. Under a gold standard, standard money is gold coin and bullion. Fiduciary media are transferable claims to the standard money, but for which no standard money actually exists, and their leading form today and for many generations is checking deposits. A checking deposit is a claim to dollars, but the banks do not actually have the dollars. They have a very modest amount of dollars, and all of the rest is loans and investments of one form or another. Now, at present in the United States, checking deposits in various types amount to approximately $2.1 trillion. We could have a somewhat higher or lower estimate, but that's roughly it. The reserves of standard money behind those 2.1 trillion are a mere 46 billion. Thus, the presently outstanding magnitude of fiduciary media is 2.1 trillion less 46 billion. So that's roughly 2.05 trillion. Now, the standard money reserves are on the order of 2.2%. They've never been any lower than this. What makes it possible for them to be this low is the Federal Reserve System is ready to create all of the additional standard money that might be required in the face of any difficulties. Now, the existence of fiduciary media is what creates the potential for deflation. That is, the literal wiping out of money and a consequent reduction in the volume of spending in the economic system. This is because the overwhelming backing for fiduciary media is debt. The debts incurred by borrowers when the banks grant them loans consisting of fiduciary media. Those debts, those IOUs and securities, are held by the banks as by far the major asset standing behind their checking deposit liabilities. Whenever anything happens that causes a significant inability of debtors to repay their debts to the banks, there's a corresponding reduction in the assets of the banks. Every such reduction threatens the ability of the banks to honor their fiduciary media. A mere 5% reduction in the assets of a given bank may be great enough to reduce its overall assets below the level of its outstanding deposit liabilities. At that point, you have the potential for bank runs. The banks can't pay all the depositors. And then what happens is these checking deposits which up to then had been the equivalent of money, they lose their character as money, and they they assume the status of junk bonds, the lowest category of junk bonds. You don't know when you'll ever collect on the checking deposits, and this is how the quantity of money is actually reduced by the transformation of fiduciary media into worthless debt. And because of the reduction in the quantity of money, the quantity theory of money tells us there's less spending, there'll be less sales revenues, lower incomes. That increases the difficulty of repaying debts. There are further asset reductions, more bank failures. The whole system has the potential to be totally wiped out. That is exactly what was going on from 1929 to 1933. Now, what would prevent any such calamity would be that version of the gold standard known as the 100% reserve gold standard. Under such a gold standard, the banks do not back any part of their checking deposits with debt, they back it with actual gold reserves. And in that arrangement, any failure of debtors has no impact on the quantity of money whatsoever, does not result in a deflation, can't launch any sort of a bust cycle. So that gold standard, the 100% reserve, would be a protection against both inflation and deflation. I'm going to skip the summary. We have time for like a quarter of a question. I apologize for the computer. Let's throw it open. Maybe Mark will not look at the clock. Yes, sir, right here.
Wouldn't just having gold end up causing deflation? Wouldn't that be harmful in some way?
Why would gold cause deflation?
Because you only have a limited amount of money supply.
Yeah.
The gold would become more and more valuable over time.
Okay, you're assuming that deflation means falling prices.
Yeah.
You think inflation is rising prices, deflation is falling prices. I would say just as inflation is not rising prices, but an increase in the quantity of money, more specifically an increase more rapid than gold, deflation should not be thought of as falling prices. Deflation should be thought of in terms of a monetary financial contraction. It should be thought of as a reduction in the quantity of money and or volume of spending. Now, if we had the same volume of spending, the same volume of spending is capable of buying an indefinitely large quantity of goods at lower prices, and if there were the same volume of spending to produce the goods, you'd have the same level of costs. If you have same sales, same costs, you have the same profit. An increase in production means falling unit costs and falling prices. No problems. And with gold, the increase in gold adds something to profits. For elaboration, see my book, chapters 12 and 19. Yes, right here, sir.
That was my first question, actually. My second question was that I've heard a theory out there that inflation over the long run actually doesn't matter. It doesn't make any difference because the market kind of adjusts for it. It was proposed by Gordon and Stroop in the book, What Everyone Should Know About Economics and Prosperity.
Well,
What's your opinion on that?
my opinion is that it wipes out people. It wipes out large numbers of people. It shrinks the buying power of their incomes. There are many people living on annuities who have inherited fixed sums, widows with life insurance policies, and each year that prices rise, their buying power is progressively reduced.
Wouldn't that be considered more the short run, though?
But that's the rest of their lives. That gentleman right there.
Sometimes in the press you read, or I've read that the economy still runs strong because of spending. You know, people spend money, and so that makes the economy still work despite all other difficulties. And I mean, how does that affirmation relate to what you're explaining? Because it sounds to me that it's not true.
Well, the spending, the more and more quantity of money has just made some prices that much higher. What would be the problem if we were doing business at 1/10 the level of prices? I mean, the increase in the quantity of money is enriching some people at the expense of others. It's helping to wipe out people who are dependent on fixed assets, fixed incomes, and it allows the government to increase its size. We have the government consuming over 40% of national income. That's only the result of people thinking each time the government wants to do something, it's free, and then the government is doing more and more. Had they realized they have to pay for everything the government does, the government might be half the size.
Thank you very much, George.
Okay, thank you.